Okay, what I'm going to do in the interest of time is call the meeting to order, recognizing that we do have quorum. And with that, we have two sets of minutes, and obviously not seeing members of the public here, so there would be no public portion of this meeting. I'm trying to expedite the meeting a little bit to get to the main issues that we want to discuss, which are the audit results. Can I get a motion from a member of the committee for approval of the June 21st, 2022 minutes?
So moved.
Can I get a second, please?
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
With the minutes reflected, all in attendance approved the minutes of June the 21st. And I will entertain a motion for approval of the minutes of July 5th.
So moved.
Can I get a second, please?
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Again, let the minutes reflected, all in attendance, approve the minutes of July 5th, 2022. I will postpone Ms. Gitten's presentation for the school board and move forward to discussion of the follow-up audit to be presented by RSM.
All right, thank you all for the time today. So the first report that we're going to talk through is the follow-up audit. We were basically performing some follow-up procedures on 3 prior issued audits that were issued in a facility construction audit was issued in July of 2020. Human resources, recruiting, and onboarding audit was issued in May of 2021, and a purchasing and procurement compliance was issued also in May of 2021. So based on our observations, recommendations, and the management's responses to those audits, we conducted follow-up testing, basically to confirm that if management said that they were going to implement something in response to one of our recommendations or to the observation, and they said that it was going to be complete by a certain date, we conducted testing to validate that either it was complete or if in the case that they weren't complete, we provided an update in the report for the audit committee for the findings that remained open. So for the facility construction report, there were 3 original findings. All 3 have been closed based on the results of our testing. We didn't find any new reportable observations, and noted that for the 3 observations that were originally there, management had implemented their action plans. We were able to perform testing to confirm that the action plans were in place and were operating effectively. Understanding that you all had some time to read through the report, and in the interest of time, I won't necessarily go into unless you guys have any specific questions, but happy to answer questions about those observations specifically.
Does anyone on the committee have any questions related to the follow-up work performed by RSM? If I may, the only correction on this note, and it's minor, would be on page 1 of your report. It indicates that the report will be presented at the audit committee at our meeting of August the 2nd, 2022. It should be August the 3rd. I apologize, being an auditor, I always have to find something.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So moving forward from facilities construction, I'll move into HR, where we had a total of 5 findings, and I'll walk you through each of those. We were able to close one of them, but what I'll do is just walk us through each one of these, starting on page 8. So the first finding is related to some of the decentralized HR procedures that exist. What we identified during the original audit was that the only positions were the instructional hires that were actually required to use this HR mandated screening rubric. So the reason why we considered that to be a risk, obviously, is it promotes inconsistency in the way that we interview some of our applicants, or certainly how we document that process. The second component of that actually was just that, the documentation that substantiates some of the decisions that were made, including interview notes, candidate scores, screening tools, etc. So as part of this, what we've done is in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see on each one of these observations, we've provided an updated management comment that reflects where they are in remediation. You'll see here they have actually gone through the exercise of updating some of the training materials
that they're utilizing, and they have actually implemented a requirement for using a standardized rubric going forward, and that documentation is now expected to be uploaded in the PeopleSoft. They have a June 2023 estimated completion date, and again, that's because they want to make sure that they have time to adequately train these individuals as they initiate this new process. So this item will remain open until full remediation is complete.
And that's for current, and that's for current administrative support staff, and then is that gonna be as part of onboarding for any new administrative support staff?
The expectation is going forward, all administrators and support staff will be utilizing this new process and documenting it consistently.
If I may, the one question I had on that finding is, originally it was deemed to be completed, and now the observation is being remaining open, and actually with a complete estimated completion date of June 2023.
Yes.
Is there what transpired, because this is for public information as well, what transpired that it was deemed to be closed when the audit was conducted, and now has been reopened?
Yeah, I think there was, through our discussions with management, what we learned, there certainly has been turnover, that there's certainly been some changes in not just the management, but also the team themselves. This audit being performed in 2020, I think that part of that is they have to retrain some of those individuals who are in some of those positions now, so there's just a new opportunity to standardize that, which is why you see their training materials were one of the things that they knew they needed to update since this audit was performed.
Thank you.
There's no additional questions on that. I'll move to page 9. It'll be our second item here related to HR. This is the pre-employment drug testing. This one's fairly straightforward. What we found during the original audit was, while a positive drug test may have been something that was retained, we didn't actually see negative evidence of a negative drug test for those safety-sensitive positions that are required to. And that's really just an administrative change that they had to make. They just didn't document the negative test, which obviously is the positive. That's what allows them to move forward in the process. But without evidence of that, we couldn't confirm that that was actually obtained. So that's something that they have changed. They've updated their process, their pre-employment drug screening results process, and it requires now that this information be retained. We actually did some drug testing in this area. 8 bus drivers were tested, and we confirmed that a negative drug test was verified for each one of those. So we're comfortable with this.
Any questions on that finding? Thank you.
Perfect. Moving to page 10, this is compliance with federal and state statute, specifically referring to some of the new hire documentation that we were looking for at the time, I-9 forms and loyalty oath. So through testing, we actually identified 2 exceptions during this round of follow-up testing. One of the I-9 forms did not have the employee's signature, and one of the loyalty oaths was not signed and dated by the employee. So due to the nature of the exceptions, although they have implemented some additional training, we feel this item should remain open until we can gain comfort that all sample selections are tested and verified without exception. Again, similar situation with new staff, turnover training is clearly a priority for
And that's what I was gonna ask you, what is the process, because I know the I-9 form is something that is mandatory. And having an issue with the I-9 form, I can understand the loyalty oath, but an I-9, there should be no reason that any error existed there.
I agree.
Is the loyalty oath a state document, or is that the county document?
I think somewhere in here it said state.
It's required. That's our
Statute, there it is.
Or statute. Any other questions
So
on this?
one finding, and is this just a typo, or is this what it says, one I-9 didn't have the employer signature, or is that employee? So did,
That should be employee.
okay. Well, that says they didn't know if someone from the county would have to sign off on it.
Good question.
Okay.
Out of curiosity,
Yeah.
was it the same employee, do we know if both of those exceptions related to one file, or was 2 separate files?
My understanding is there's 2 separate. Okay. There's no additional questions, I'll move to page 11, our onboarding documentation and employee personnel files. So this is some of that key onboarding documents that we keep, your job posting request forms, fingerprints, background checks, proof of education, applicable certifications. All of these were expected to be retained. We didn't see evidence of these. We actually identified 7 incomplete onboarding documents and 3 missing onboarding documents as part of the original review. At the time, we learned that HR specialists can use their own informal onboarding checklist to verify that everything is obtained, but no standardized formal tool existed. Since our audit, though, they have implemented a standardized new hire checklist, or at least they're in the process of creating that. Their intention is to standardize that and ensure that all of the individuals are using that to document what's obtained and making sure everything is retained properly.
Do we know the nature of the onboarding documents? Are they administrative or are they all state-based or regulatory-based requirements?
So I think it's a combination of both, based on the nature of the position. If it's safety sensitive, that's gonna influence what additional documentation would be required to process. But fingerprinting, proof of education, that's qualifications, right?
Sure.
What is the, I mean, these are documents from HR as far as onboarding. And did you look at the documents that are done in the schools or in the departments for onboarding? And, I mean, was that a part of it? And are they in line to put in with what HR has? If I'm not making sense.
No, that's a great question. That's actually our second observation, though, was the decentralized processes that they have. It leads to some inconsistency in how those documents are being retained.
Because in other words, so if we're finalizing a hire at a school, like say for a teacher, how does that all feed into what HR is doing, and can that be streamlined?
And that's what they're working on. I believe that's part of the change that they're looking to implement, is to ensure that all of that documentation is being obtained through the use of a checklist and verifying that, actually testing that information has been obtained. So it provides an independent check.
So, but again, manual checklists are not doing anything systemically. The system could kind of say, hey, this is still there.
Yeah, in my understanding, it's a tabletop checklist that they're using. It might be electronic, but it's not automated.
So is the
To my
overarching
understanding.
plan to use PeopleSoft as a digital checklist then?
Yeah.
And throughout the entire school system, so when administrators are hiring, they can utilize this to ensure compliance?
Possible. They're still developing their plan. That's why it's gonna remain open as they consider which options make the most sense from an efficiency perspective, but also from an operational perspective.
So right now, each individual school has their own checklist onboarding process and then there's.
I believe it depends on the position.
Okay, I'm just trying, to sort of understand the scope, because it sounds like, it could be, whatever the checklist itself could be different across.
Yeah.
And how they retain the documents, what documents they're retaining, all of that,
Yeah, the screening, certainly when they're screening employees, they have inconsistency in the rubrics, like I was mentioning,
Sure.
that they're using. And that's part of what they're trying to do, is standardize as many of these processes as they can. It's not just the screening process, but the new hire process. So after someone is brought on, making sure that documentation is retained, kind of runs in the same thing.
Does HR organizational hierarchy roll up through the district though? There's ultimately an HR lead that filters down.
Yep.
They want to make sure they roll within the schools.
Right.
Just as a point, I having worked with the PeopleSoft system and all that, I think that would be an excellent idea. Because if the teacher, I mean, if an administrator at one school is looking at an employee, they can look on and see everything, and there's a little bit of coaching going on. So they can see at what stage they're in and know, after you reach certain stage, then you're locked in type thing.
You could have a database of all of the driver's licenses, all that stuff, so it removes some redundancies as well, possible. How much coaching occurs, but at least the district would have that, those documents already within the database.
Is PeopleSoft the primary HR system?
Well, that's what they're using now to document the documents that are received. That's the expectation.
And do they have a separate training or learning management system?
No, my understanding is they have a manual that they provide, the Hiring Lilly County Way training material. That's the primary use that they're using to,
So they don't have a training system?
not that I'm aware of, but I'd want to confirm that and get back to you on that.
If I may, one concern I have is, based on the new completion dates, we have a lost school year. Because they are not implementing corrective action or requesting implementation until June of 2023. And with the number of new hires, staff movement, promotions, etc., there's a lot that can go on in these files, and I'm gonna go back to the finding I asked about the I-9 and the oath. That equates to a 10% error rate based on 25 files reviewed, and 2 of those 25 files had errors. That's why I was hoping it was gonna be one file, I could live with one, not necessarily comfortably, but I could live with it a lot easier than I could with 2 files. And now, we're holding off for a year before it would be appropriate for you to go back in and determine whether or not the appropriate corrective action was implemented. I don't know what other approach that may be through executive staff, that something could be, some kind of internal monitoring could be performed to give this committee, and obviously yourselves as well, some comfort that when you come in sometime after June of 2023, that you're not gonna be surprised because there was turnover or other issues that occurred, that now that can get kicked down the road yet again. Because that audit was a 2021 audit.
Might have been sooner than that, right? No, yeah, you're right, early, yep, yeah.
And now we're in mid-2022, and now we're talking mid-2023 before, so that's 2 years
Long way time, yeah.
before corrective action has been put in place.
And I think that, again, this is when management believes that they can provide the necessary training they believe is necessary to remediate the challenge or the risk, right, that we're identifying. But I think our perspective is certainly, if it can be completed sooner, that should be the priority, right, like any of these other items.
So is the challenge for the delay basically determining whether or not PeopleSoft is an appropriate system-wide solution or exploring other options? Like, is that the reason for the delay, just trying to figure out what's the most efficient way to do this? Or is it more just implementing it is more of a challenge, or is it both?
I think based on our discussion with him, it's kind of both. There's resource constraints that are preventing maybe that immediate corrective action or time, that investment that he knows he needs in order to make this right. And then it's also finding the right solution. So my understanding is that was what went into this estimated completion date.
Okay, so it's twofold, all right.
And can I say maybe, using we had the superintendent here to see his take on it as well, because, and I don't want to put you on the spot.
Oh, sure, no, I know,
I was like, okay, you should know this.
that's what you pay me for. There's a number of different things that I'd like to just address really quickly. One is that PeopleSoft is the manner and means by which we track our HR processes. We have some outstanding tickets in PeopleSoft that would require additional programming. I could bore you with how PeopleSoft was implemented in the school district. But the way school districts normally adopt software is they don't adopt software and change process. They attempt to change software. So workarounds, coding issues were inserted into the PeopleSoft program that now when we try to do other things, individualized code is now standing in our way that's connected to other issues. So it's more complicated than that as we try to pull it apart. When you pull something apart, you'd like it to separate cleanly. When you pull this apart, it has tentacles to it. I've already had a conversation with our HR chief. 2023 is currently unacceptable to the superintendent. A lot of the policies and procedures are in place. It's a matter of following through, i.e. when I see assistant principal candidates, I'm now asking for the entire file, including the metric and matrix that was used in order to screen. I'm looking for all the quality checks to make sure that all the correct steps outlined in our HR procedures have been used. I do the same thing with principal appointments because I'm not approving someone until those steps are followed. You currently also have a superintendent who is following the HR processes. We are not appointing people without going through the entire roles. My expectation is that we'll be back and revisiting this long before June 2023, short of potentially all of the training that would be necessary. Clearly, we have some priorities in the next 2.5 weeks of getting up and moving. But as soon as those trainings are available, we do have a training platform with which to produce that training on. So there is we do 410 minutes now, is that, am I correct? Just nod.
That was before the new statutes.
That was before the new statute, so there's more time now than 410. I'm about 200 minutes in. But we do have a training platform where training can be put out, it can be reviewed, there are quizzes at the end, and the employee who took the quiz and has that now standard met, they're tracked, and we know that that individual is trained and will come back annually or every other year, depending on what's required based upon statute or our own organizational expectation.
Can I say one thing, in the same vein as what he was talking about, and we're talking about training. My question is who or whom?
Hiring.
No, I mean, who would be trained, because like right now, for example, in the schools, it's the principal secretary has the lion's share of all that. And maybe if we're looking at systems, look at the who and how and the time they have to do as well. In other words, if you're gonna take the car apart, let's clean all the parts before we put it back together.
When you think about the 410 minutes that I'm speaking of, that's 410 minutes that I have to do. That has nothing to do with my secretary or school secretary. That's 410 minutes that I have to personally do. This training of doing things the Lee County HR way would be something that every person who has a hiring manager authority level would have to accomplish, including me. The key is to ensure that the way we go about a hiring process, whether it's done in a school, done in maintenance, done in IT, or done out of the superintendent's office, that it follows a pattern and set of procedures, including capturing loyalty oaths and I-9s. The I-9 was not signed by the employee. I don't know how that happened. It was certainly put in front of them if they signed the loyalty oath. But somehow when it was collected, there was not a signature from the employee on the I-9, and I agree with you. An I-9 is a pretty important form. It determines citizenship and your ability to be employed within the United States. We can't afford to miss those.
Don't take poker with that person. If I may, and I appreciate, Superintendent, how seriously you've taken this matter. Any guidance you might be able to provide to the superintendent for mitigating controls would, again, be greatly appreciated, recognizing that PeopleSoft seems to be one of our sticking points in getting the process fully aboard. And so any ideas that you may have seen in other districts where you have done audits that may be a benefit, and obviously ultimately it's going to be the superintendent's decision to implement or portions therefore to implement, but that would be greatly appreciated.
Sure, I think we can schedule some time with Dr. Doty and the superintendent to explore where the roadblocks that are currently in place, make sure we have that, and you can certainly speak to mitigating controls.
Mr. Chair, please.
Yes.
Mr. Dodig, as well as anybody in the executive council, has a standing meeting with the superintendent. Between the entire team, 2 times a month, I have everybody who's a chief executive officer of this organization with me every other week. This is an item that goes on the HR agenda that does not come off until this audit is complete. There'll be additional conversations with our instructional technology team regarding the outstanding e-tickets. There's some good work to do. We'll get it done.
Absolutely. Yes.
Security wise, as we look as though we're adding more to PeopleSoft and looking at range as well. And it's wonderful to put all of this in one place, but some of the things that we're putting in there, does that create more of a security issue because we do have more things in there at this point?
Well, we already have confidential information in PeopleSoft in our major systems, so it's not really a dramatic change in what we do there.
Okay.
So I imagine PeopleSoft, you already have your social security numbers, all that sort of stuff for all employees, so put his driver's license, whatever. You're already carving it in PII.
Okay.
Ideally, we can reduce the number of locations that contain this type of sensitive information.
By putting it all together. Okay, thank you.
Well, that's my question. My question would be the fields. If you add in, the fields would need to be encrypted. So it's which fields, not every field in a database is encrypted. So, it still is a legitimate concern about adding sensitive data, confidential data in a database. Because nothing gets you in trouble with other states as quickly as a breach. And many companies have been breached. Heck, the Pentagon had a breach. So,
Cybersecurity is the number one risk, you're spot on, yeah, considering that.
Please continue.
Absolutely. Well, for the purpose of time, I'll move on to page 13 here. This is the last HR finding, and it is related to the approval of what we describe here as atypical new hires. And really, the board is responsible for approving all new hires, and they're given that responsibility as a means to formally identify these individuals as suitable for the position or for the policy. So what we highlight here is really, there's an opportunity for them to separate individuals who don't meet the qualifications so that the board has an opportunity to identify those and make those determinations separately. It'll just obviously increase the efficiency of their review and enhance how productive that review is. HR is actually considering changes to job descriptions currently, and they're actually having, they're contracting with Neola to perform a review of all board policies. So this is something that they have as a remain open as they continue to determine kind of what the best strategy for presenting this type of information is to the board, because obviously that's sensitive in nature, and we don't necessarily want to imply that individuals should be called out for not being qualified, right? We just want to make sure that the board is empowered to understand where those situations may arise, and they can make those decisions separately. So this will
What defines the minimum requirements?
The job description, the job description sets out minimum goals.
Okay.
And if
So like
if an
5 to
employee,
7 years.
5 to 7 years of experience, a master's degree is a minimum qual, doctorate would be preferred. So we wouldn't hold them to the preferred category, but employees coming before the board, first of all, board employee basically approves all employees. I think it's really important for that. The other piece is that I've expressed that while this item is important for us to encapsulate within policy, as we did our exit interview, I don't plan to bring people who don't meet minimum qualifications to the board for employment. We keep jobs open until we find the right people.
And there's only two, and I know I'll get them wrong, attorney, only two reasons that the board can turn down an applicant. And if you want to quote it correctly, so I don't.
So the only opportunity for the board to not approve the recommendation of the superintendent per statute and applicable case law is for a good cause. A good cause meaning moral turpitude or not having the qualifications for the position.
This is not audit question, it's just general intellectual curiosity. What spectrum of employees are we talking about? Is this management and up, or is this like from the entire spectrum of district employees? Just curious.
Does the board have to approve a maintenance plan?
Yeah, that was kind of what I was going, is this the entire,
The board approves all.
okay. It's gotta be a funny meeting.
And sometimes, like at the beginning of the year, you see that list just goes on and on and on and on. When the, reassignments and all of that, I'm sorry.
The annual reappointment.
Right.
So the board approves, board's not gonna approve maintenance worker. Board's gonna approve administrators, teachers. That's who, there's a cutoff. It's usually all the administrators, and they'll approve transfers. They do approve transfers. They're treated like a new hire, so they approve transfers and those types of things.
On that, but the attorneys are rescued.
That's my job.
If I may, on page 13 as well, what was the sample size? Because it indicated that you noted 2 hired employees that did not meet the minimum qualifications. Out of how many? 21.
Are you speaking to the original audit? I can tell you if you do.
Based on the nature of the testing, I'm sure it's 25, but we'll double check.
And while he's looking at that, so I understand that the intention would be that we bring people who are qualified, but is there a process in place that will hopefully be sooner than June 23rd again, where if someone does not meet a qualification, but we still think they're a worthy applicant or worth consideration, that would be brought to the board, considering that is one of the things that they can statutorily need to be reviewing.
One of the things that the policies speak to is the requirement of the superintendent to tell the board related to these types of hires. I've just made a commitment to them that I won't hire these types of people. But I can see circumstances whereby there could be someone who would take an interim title, something like that. But the board has been clear about their desire to not have people trained specifically like on the job, especially in an important chief function. So we have, for instance, left a number of job openings since I've been here, continuing to advertise till I have a pool of candidates worth working through. The most recent one is an example of our chief operations officer. It took us almost 3.5 months to collect 31 resumes. Then we followed the HR process. We trimmed 31 to 11, we trimmed 11 to 8, and then we did screening interviews, and we trimmed 8 to 5, we're down to 1. And I'm sure he is, if he's listening, I'm sure he's interviewing me as much as I am interviewing him on Friday. We've extended an offer of employment, but in this world, currently in the education field, people can write their own tickets. So he's coming to do due diligence this weekend with family and neighbors, but also spend some time with the superintendent. I just think it's really, they're out there, we should have to be willing to keep digging to find the right people.
Good. That's great. Yes.
I don't remember who asked the question, but the original sample size for the audit that was done in 2021 was 40 new hires.
40, okay.
And it's not just education that's struggling to hire.
Yes, sir, it's not
And
the nationwide issue.
when you hear me often say I'm cautiously optimistic, but more optimistic than cautious. It's the way that the superintendent has been looking into the hiring process and committing to the board that we won't have those two, if at all possible, because he will have vetted and done everything necessary.
It's not just a warm body, it's a very capable warm body.
Right, and I think the thing I like the most is saying, until we find the right person, just leave it off.
Yeah, the wheels will keep turning.
Yep.
Thank you, and on to,
I'll move to page 15, which will be our first purchasing and procurement compliance audit finding. This specific finding is related to ownership of the vendor master, cleaning up the vendor data, making sure that that's in line with expectations. December of 22 is the estimated completion.
So is vendor data being managed decentralized?
No, I would say it wasn't actively being managed. So the vendor file, when someone is set up as a vendor, there wasn't proactive measures, procedures in place for going back in and cleaning that data. If someone is inactive, for example, we don't want to keep them in active status. That's just an easy example of something that we would expect.
The nature of the errors, the aid, were they recent, newly added vendors? Were they old, but like any detail on what those errors were?
In the original audit?
In the original audit, yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm not sure of the exact nature of the aid, but I'm sure that they were diversified, at least our sample was. And I can get back to you on what those look like.
Yeah, because I mean, when I hear that, it's kind of scary, right? I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
you could theoretically put a new vendor in and go through a process, and all of a sudden they're paying. I mean, there's obviously lots of other things, but when you hear about the vendor master file, you get a little spooky type.
Well, what we often see with districts is some vendors are vendors for a very long time.
Sure.
So, I mean, if you're a vendor for as long as some are, sometimes that documentation can go missing, right? If it's saved in a certain location and some of those processes change, that often is what contributes to this.
So what's also interesting here, and for the superintendent to be aware, one of the number one cybersecurity risks is spoofing vendor data and having them change your bank routing, so that way when you say, hey, pay me my money, it's routed, so like, it's actively being hit. We've gotten multiple hits at our corporation with people trying to change vendor data, so when you hear unmanaged vendor files, that gets a little curious. Moving it to budget, that's fine. But again, I assume then it's locked down just to the budgeting team to manage and maintain that.
Budget is taking full responsibility of this process, yeah. And again, this is more about formalizing the efforts that are being performed.
Sure.
If I may, I have the audit report in hand, page 11 of that audit.
Yes, sir.
Brings forth again that PeopleSoft is the culprit. And these were vendors that have been in place for over 10 years. And the applications were not retained or updated since the department converted to PeopleSoft in 2009.
Which is why one of the biggest parts of our recommendation was that they not just ensure that training is provided to make sure this documentation is obtained. Oftentimes, that's not the issue. The issue is how do you retain that information and how do you go back in and make sure that that documentation was requested and pulled. And part of that is actively managed vendors. Especially vendors.
Historical vendors is gonna always be a challenge, because as you said, vendors go back to the dawn of time. And you could sample another 40 vendors going back in 2009 and still find two, even if they put new procedures in place.
Yeah.
Because you can't recreate old documents that you don't know where they are. I'm more concerned with going forward and also the maintenance. Are these vendors active, inactive? If they're active, then you could update MSAs, you could update your SALs, all that sort of paperwork.
And according to their report, they are active vendors that have been recently paid.
Which is why it's so critical that they have this formal process for training.
But isn't it also as we set up these processes, to be able to say, well, that was this person's responsibility to do that, so at least we have somewhere to go.
Yeah,
And then
or a group of people, right, a process.
Right, and saying,
All
well,
responsible for
this is what happened so that we can fix it.
Yeah.
But then also in, the current situation we're in with hiring, and there has been turnover, so,
Just real quickly, this is about ownership. This is about determining what I refer to as a business process owner. So each one of the chiefs, there are specific items that a business process owner owns. This in particular is Susan Millay, who's doing a fantastic job of owning this. She's pretty sure she can be done with December by having this updated and then being the owner moving forward. She's one deep in terms of cross-training another person within the budget department, just in case there was, for lack of a better term, an injury or demise. We wouldn't lose step. And to your point about ACH transfers, I'd love to tell you that the district's there already. We are not. We still have multiple checks and balances as we cut checks to vendors. But we're not transferring money electronically, which is a bane of my existence because I know it's cheaper to transfer money ACH-wise than it is to cut paper checks. So we'll be moving forward in that realm as well. But I think the ownership of this database was the critical component in making sure that it's consistently updated.
Perfect. I'll move to page 16 here, our second finding here, monitoring of non-competitive purchases. So specifically what we're referring to are purchases between 35 and 50,000. Statute outlines very specific requirements for what's expected for purchases within this range. So as part of our original audit, what we were looking for was a detective control, not simply a preventative control, that could provide some on-site oversight and monitoring that these purchases are supported by the documentation that's expected. Obviously, if it goes over 50,000, there's even more strict and strenuous measures that need to be taken to make sure that it's competitively bid or solicited. But just to be clear, we're referring to 35 to 50. At the time, they didn't have that mechanism. What we've learned since is that they have worked to identify a query that can assist them in identifying these purchases so that they can make sure that everything is supported as expected. Through our testing, we tested a query 5 from that query and verified that all required documentation was available. Everything could be ticked and tied. We also tested the completeness of the query itself just to make sure that it was pulling in all the data that would be expected within this range without exception either. So we determined this can be closed. There's also not many purchases that fall within this range, to be clear, so the risk itself flow list.
Is that query being reviewed? So you tested off that query to make sure, but they're reviewing that query actively, right?
Yeah, and what they provided actually was a detailed explanation next to each item as to why it wasn't. Perfect, I'll move to page 18 if there's no other questions there. Purchasing procedures manual, pretty common, finding that we see it at most of our districts. There's always an opportunity to enhance and provide some additional training. In this case, they have provided, they've implemented an annual mandatory training for new bookkeepers, but they're still contracting with Neola to update some of those relevant policies and procedures. So until that's complete, this item will remain open, but again, that is in the process. They are confident that'll be completed shortly. Any questions on this item? Perfect. I'll move to our last item here on page 19 then, which was the purchasing performance measures. So they, at the time of our review, they used this, we identified Act Point, which was a wonderful tool that they were using to actually identify performance data and monitor against some of their comparable districts. What we learned though was there were some concerns with the data itself when we tested it to completeness. Since then though, they have revised the data capture to include that to ensure that all the relevant data is being obtained and that it's accurate. We went through testing and reviewed the most recent annual Act Point that was produced and verified that all data fields were completed and accurate, and we are comfortable closing this item as well. We think this is a wonderful tool for them, one of the more impressive dashboards that we've seen in Segment. Another great item that Susan's implemented. All right, any questions on follow?
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to go back onto our agenda, as Ms. Giddens is here. Do you have anything to present to us on behalf of the school board?
Is it August 24th yet?
Not yet.
Basically, my head's swimming right about now, but, I can't, so first of all, I apologize for not, being at the presentation, but I was listening and watching, and all of you that participated did an awesome job representing us well. And when I think about this committee, I am so excited about what you do and your expertise, and watch the interaction and the level of knowledge and the level of questions. And I can't say enough thank you. And I also will say to our volunteer committee that can we have people on more than one committee, Attorney Bruno?
No.
Oh, okay. So do not look at the application that is out now to be on advisory boards, even though you may love to do something else we need you here. As far as the board is concerned, it's an interesting time for the board with all that's going on, of course, politically and all that. So it's kind of a wait and see. One thing that we do know is that we will have 2 new board members, as Ms. Fisher and Ms. Vaughn will not be returning, they are retiring. So we will have 2 new board members, and we will have to mesh together with 2 new people, and depending on who else returns. So that's kind of in the play right now. Of course, in a political season, I think everybody's has the armchair quarterback about education and what they think and all of that. And I will say that if people have questions, start with the district first, start with the superintendent or his designee to get those questions answered succinctly, I'll say that. And I will say, because I've had this question, whatever happens on August 23rd, those of us that, Miss Jordan and I, our time does not end until November. So you will still have to deal with it until November, one way or the other. I don't know, anything else, any questions that you guys have for me regarding the board?
I do have one, on behalf of a number of the members. some of us, all of our terms, I should say, coincide with the board member that appointed us. When would terms expire for those individuals whose board members are up for re-election this year?
Attorney, I'm believing that would be when our term is over in November. So for myself and Ms. Jordan, our appointees. But it's interesting though, appointees kind of cross over. So it's not necessarily that, you have to remind everybody or whatever. It's optimal to me to have representatives from the area that you represent, so that all areas are represented. But there's nothing that, precludes another board member saying, you're doing an awesome job and I will recommend you. But yes, it will be November for the two of us. And the others would be on until 2 more years.
So, and Ms. Gibbons is absolutely correct, it's pursuant to board policy 1.71. 1.171 that explicitly says that it will be staggered and you will follow the term of your board member that was appointed, that appointed you, I should say.
I hope that's not a sign.
And then just.
I'm sorry.
And going back to the original question she asked, I said no, very quickly, but that's also in the board policy with regards to serving on another advisory committee.
I was rescued.
And the reason for the question is to know continuation of our meetings, whether or not we can actually have a meeting in November or December, because we will not know if the existing members of this committee will be reappointed, those who are following the terms of existing board members, of which there are 4. So we would not have
There are 4
quorum.
members that would be affected.
Yes.
Did we do 2 or just 1?
We did one.
And I think the chair did 2.
Each board member did 1.
Okay.
7 of us.
One.
Okay,
So
so
that's
then
why I'm
that would
asking.
mean the quorum as well.
Then that's why I'm asking the question, because that would
Where
eliminate.
there were some alternates, I don't know if they would be sufficient to.
So, Mr. Chairman, for me. So, what will happen is my recommendation is that you have another meeting prior to the swearing in of the new board member. So sometime in October or November, have a meeting, and then from there, after November, probably the first task that the new board members will do is to appoint people on this committee.
And that's what I'm just trying to understand, where we may fall in their priority, because it will impact the ability of this committee to continue with its existing members, new members coming on board, but also to legally hold a meeting, because it will be 4 individuals on this committee who may or may not.
So the board members will be encouraged to move forward with their selection so that it can be brought to probably at the top of the year, so that you will be able to either have a meeting in December or have a meeting in January.
And what I'll do then is add that to my list to take back to the board
Thank you.
to mention that, we need to look at that for the continuity of this committee and the work that.
Yes, really. I don't know who I was appointed by. I probably should know that, but like, who of the 7 of us are.
Next, you were appointed by Kathleen Morgan. Mr. List, you were appointed by Ms. Guam. Mr. Swank, you were appointed by Ms. Gittens. Mr. Sund, you were appointed by Ms. Giovanelli. Mr. Carrington, you were appointed by Ms. Petricca. I was appointed by Ms. Jordan. And Ms. Howard was appointed by Ms. Fisher.
Some of you are.
And that's why I'm saying that there will be 4 of us that would potentially, and that would negate the ability to hold
To
a
have a
quorum.
meeting.
And I will take under advisement with your recommendation as to having a meeting
at least in October, prior to election, we should have a meeting.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I may as
Yes.
well, and the term would be 4 years. So after 4 years, you would reapply. So once this first cycle manifests itself, everybody should be on there for 4 years. If that makes sense.
4 years or 3 years?
4 years for the policy. You will follow the term of the board member.
Okay, and unless you have any other questions for me, if anyone does. All right.
Deals with cybersecurity, critical infrastructure information, and other information technology security matters. As such, these items should be discussed in an executive session with only those individuals noted in Board Policy 1.171, Audit Committee, any representatives from our Information Technology Department Division, and the court reporter who will be transcribing. So at this time, I'm asking that we take a 1-minute break to ensure compliance.
Okay, with that said, we will take a 1-minute break. Let the minutes reflect that at 6:45, we ended executive session and we are reconvening. The one item I'd like to continue in discussion with RSM relates to the audit plan.
A recommendation of 4 audits was made to the school board, which were cyber threat,
The half-cent sales tax, contract compliance and purchase cards, and I will leave it to RSM, the school board, through the school board attorney to determine which audit occurs where within the 1-year timeline or whatever timeline is agreed to with the school board.
Sure, so just to comment on that, our intention was to go in the order that the committee had presented it to the board. But specific timing will work out with the attorney and the board.
Thank you. And going to Mr. Sund, you had mentioned something as well about security, physical security. Is that a recommendation that you would like us to put before the school board for consideration for
audit number 5?
Yes, because I just do think, from what we've heard, I think that one item that we presented can wait, and I think it would just be duplicative use of resources. So at this point, I'd be comfortable making a motion that we would add a physical security penetration test to our recommendation for what the school board would consider, and then let the school board and staff figure out what order that should be done in with the other 3.
Okay. Do I have a second to that motion about adding a physical security audit? Okay, hearing a second, is there any further discussion?
I don't disagree with doing that. I guess my question is more about just process, right? We've kind of set sail, and is that poor reflection on us as an audit committee if we're then going back and saying, no, we were just kidding, now we're saying it's this?
We're just adding on an additional audit.
Okay.
That would be for the school board to determine.
Okay.
Well, and if I may interpret, I think what Mr. Sund is saying is actually pulling back on CTI, the cyber threat intelligence, based off of the information we just received in the executive committee, executive session. So I don't think that would reflect, I don't think there would be a reflection with the audit committee. I think that is, as we receive more information about the maturity of the cyber program, that we could reevaluate kind of those priorities in light of that additional information. As a cyber IT guy, I actually would agree and with Mr. Sund that gives our IT team time to continue down their path. And then something as part of the subsequent audit plan, looking into making that one of the top priorities at that time. Because again, you're talking the next audit year by the time we're there.
If I may, as a point of clarification, Ms. Bruno, would that rescind what a board decision would have been made
From there.
last meeting to start this process all over again.
So the board will be voting, so when they actually vote will be on the SOW when it comes before them. But if you want to add an additional audit, then yes, I would recommend going to the board and saying you would like to recommend an additional audit so that they can then direct myself and RSM to work on an SOW that would include that additional audit.
And I think in fundamental nature, it's just a reprioritization. The audit committee was deeply uncomfortable with the cyber component, the cyber aspect of the threat to the district. And I think, I'm speaking for us, but I think we all feel a lot better about that threat level right now.
Yeah.
So we are still deeply uncomfortable with the physical assessment. And so we would like to deprioritize cyber and reprioritize physical.
Which I think still will, the board is going to make that decision, if that's okay with them.
I mean, still, the recommendation would be for Mr. Cohen or somebody from the committee to come and explain that to the board, and then have the board then say, staff, I want to direct you to move forward with the SOW that addresses that.
And then a question there, it's my understanding that the school board will receive the same executive session that we did. So they will see that information. Timing wise, would it make sense for us to make sure that our proposal gets to them after they've received that information, so they're aware where we're coming from? Do you think it would make them more comfortable?
No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I don't want them to think that it's all sort of not important. And if they see that information, I think they'll see where we're coming from, that it may be worth prioritizing something else because we're in a good place.
And I get that, I'm just kind of thinking outside the box as to how they may receive this. And I think we were headed down a path with a list, and the board basically approved this list. So I'm almost kind of where you're at. I just don't want to personally see us detain or deter any of the things that we've already set in motion. That's my concern, that if it's all in how it's presented, Paul.
Right.
Because if it's presented as an addition, then you're going to have issues and it's gonna go around and around and around. If it's presented more like you were saying, this was already, on our list.
Right.
And after the executive session, so I think I'm saying what you're saying, that we present this after they've seen the executive session and know that things are moving right along, and then add this. I don't know what you guys feel about it.
And I assume that the hope with that, the statement of work would include all of the audits collectively, and that this may slow that down. And we would consider what that timeline looks like, and realistically say, how important is that physical? And I don't know exactly how much of a slowdown we're talking, but that is something that I'm willing to consider. But I just did think it was worth making the switch after what we heard.
My thought in the process, and while we're still in discussion phase, would be, let's leave the 4 audits as recommended to the board, so the SOW can be prepared. Should the board approve the SOW, we can then request subsequently an addendum to the SOW.
Right.
Wherein we replace the CTI audit with a physical security audit. That would make it a lot easier, as opposed to bringing it back before the board and having them start the process, because it is a 2-phase process. The board first has to approve the consideration from this committee, and then secondarily approve a statement of work.
Right.
We've already done part 1, we're moving towards part 2 towards the end of August. If we decide to go back with this new recommendation, part 1 would have to start all over again.
Yeah, and I'm 100% comfortable with that, and I don't know, probably fairly I can withdraw the motion at that point.
Yes, you can.
Okay. So I'm comfortable, I'll withdraw that motion, and then, I would move that, once the statement of work has been completed, that we make the amendment, to swap out the cyber threat intelligence with the physical security penetration test due to the information we received.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor? Aye.
Who was my first, well, Andrew made the motion, who's my second? Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Is there anything else for the good of the order? Hearing none, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Next meeting.
We're going to have to determine that based on the statement of work, whether or not that is approved at the board level.
Okay.
So, hearing nothing else, then entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move adjourn.
Second, please. Okay, let the minutes reflect 6:54, the meeting adjourned.